Science, naturalism, philosophy, they've been the prevailing worldview, the drivers of thinking for the last few hundred years, haven't they? 17th and 18th century Enlightenment period saw an explosion of a way of thinking, a way of viewing the world, which looked at things, in some cases demonstrated a rational and natural view of the world and all of the environment which we're amongst. And in the 1680s, a process was begun which would, as it were, weaken the traditional views of the world order and the power of religion and the power of the church in the Western world at large. Gentlemen scholars, particularly those that had the wealth and, to a degree, the ability to be able to spend some time doing so, gentlemen scholars began a process of democratization of knowledge and sharing of things which they had worked out and understood according to a scientific process. And what's happened is that then a worldview has developed which has removed, as it were, the need for a God. The existence of God is questioned, challenged at every hand, as is the supernatural, if we will. And however wonderful, beautiful the world is and the extraordinary things which happen within it, however extraordinary the universe, scientists and natural philosophers will make a simple, blunt view that there is no God. They discount entirely the need for an existence of God. And miracles, the supernatural, and the very existence of God are really all parts of the same continuum. Now, of course, what happens is that scientists, in this sort of generalized view, scientists can answer the question as to how. They answer the how questions. What they're not able to do is answer the why questions. And whether your discipline is psychology or philosophy, there is an appreciation, actually without any of those disciplines really, but there's an appreciation that there is a spiritual consciousness within man which yearns for something greater than the mere natural and prosaic. I don't think that's too wild a claim. I think there is that some yearning within the man which looks for something greater than the natural. And miracles and the supernatural are aspects of that something greater, if you will. So we use the word miracle in two senses. There's a sort of generalized way of using it and a rather more specific, perhaps as you might expect. In this general sense, it's fairly loose. It has the meaning of something a little extraordinary, a little unusual, unexpected. It doesn't conform to the normal explanation of things, and some disaster is averted in the nick of time. It's something quite general. It can be used in some senses. But it can also be used in a very specific sense where the supernatural is believed to be at work in something or an event, something which is against the run of nature or is so speeded up that the result can't be explained away on normal, rational grounds. So if I turn to my dictionary for miracle, I get something like an effect or extraordinary event in the physical world that surpasses all known human or natural powers and is ascribed to a supernatural cause We get that, don't we? It might also go on to say such an effect or event manifesting or considered as a work of God. It might be a wonder or a marvel, and then this more generalized view that we mentioned a moment ago, something wonderful or surpassing expectations or some supreme quality. So miracle of modern science, might be just one such phrase. Now, the record of miracles isn't restricted to the Bible, perhaps unsurprisingly in some senses, but most major religions, most of the traditions will claim miracles in some form, and some form of evidence might be provided where their great ones have demonstrated supernatural powers. That's common across all religious traditions. Now, of course, we normally, when we look at our Bibles, associate miracles with the work of Jesus and the apostles, and reasonably so. But there are miracles recorded in the Old Testament too. And each of these is there to give evidence to and support the purpose of God. So we're going to look just casually, but we're going to look at the plagues on Egypt, which are recorded in Exodus. Moses is called to a great work to lead his people. And in Exodus chapter 3, we're only going to refer obliquely to these things to some degree, so turn to it if you will, but it's probably not important. But Exodus chapter 3, we have Moses' attention being arrested by the burning bush. So verse 2 of Exodus 3, the angel of the Lord appeared unto him, Moses, in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush, and he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. So the burning bush of itself wouldn't necessarily probably be extraordinary. Moses' attention is drawn to it, fair enough, but the thing which drew his wonder was the fact that the bush was not consumed. You see, that's the end of verse 2, end of verse 3. Why the bush is not burned. So the bush initially is the fuel for the fire, but it continues to burn. And that is what gives Moses this cause to come aside and to look. And from this miracle, Moses is then called to perform a particular work on behalf of his God. And Moses then uses two evidences of miraculous power in the one turning a rod into a serpent, and then his hand being made leprous and clean again. And those are recorded. We don't need to look at those in chapter 4. And it's the mechanism of those two miracles which Moses then uses in order to persuade the children of Israel that he is a representative of God and responding to the call. And once they themselves are persuaded that Moses is the prophet of God and is able to perform these particular miracles, they follow him, and Moses then goes and presents his case to Pharaoh, the king of the Egyptians. And in chapter 7 of Exodus, Moses lays down his rod as he had done for the children of Israel, and it becomes a serpent. Well, that's an extraordinary miracle. Rods don't turn into serpents, but Pharaoh's wise men and magicians are able to perform some version of the same thing, sufficient that it is stated that that's what they did. And so this cycle is continued. Moses turns the water into blood, and the magicians do so also. And as the plagues which are then visited on the Egyptians, there is the magicians each mimic in some way the work which Moses is doing. But when it comes to the plague of lice, the magicians are not able to match what Moses is doing. And they say in chapter 8 that this is the finger of God. There's a recognition here now on the part of the Egyptian magicians and soothsayers that this is the this is the finger of God. But despite all of that, despite the acknowledgement on the part of the magicians, Pharaoh is not persuaded. And so it goes on for the remainder of the plagues. Moses, on behalf of God, brings down these various plagues, each of them against the gods of the Egyptians. But in each case, it seems that the Pharaoh and his magicians, his wise men, explain these things away, giving some sort of natural cause to them, until it comes to the death of the firstborn, the last of the miracles which then precipitates their escape from Egypt. Maybe even then they're not persuaded. Maybe it's a level of desperation which then sends the children of Israel out of Egypt. We're working with the record which we have. But either way round, all of these things happen. They're recorded, they're evidences for a specific purpose, so that God could call out a people for his name. Moving on, in the Old Testament, one of the greatest prophets to Israel, Elijah. And there are many miracles which are recorded as being done by him, and perhaps none as dramatic as when God answers his prayer by fire. And the test is set between Elijah and those that are described as the prophets of Baal. And altars are made, sacrifices are prepared, but no fire is to be used, no external fire. And the declaration was to be that whoever was the true God that answered by fire, he was indeed to be the true God. He would be their God. And so, as it works out, I need to turn this and get my words in the right order. 1st of Kings and chapter 18. So 1st of Kings, chapter 18, the prophets of Baal have cried morning through till the afternoon, as it were, and there is no answer by fire. And what Elijah then does is repair his altar and douses the altar with water. Fire isn't going to touch that, is it? And so the demonstration is made even more dramatic. 1st of Kings 18 and verses 38 and 39. In response to Elijah's prayer, then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt sacrifice and the wood and the stones and the dust and licked up the water that was in the trench. When all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and they said, "The Lord, he is the God. The Lord, he is the God." And so these events demonstrate to those that are watching, and we who are able to read of the record in later times, they demonstrated that the God of whom Elijah was speaking and claimed to represent was indeed God, and he alone was the one that should be worshipped. Yahweh, he is the God, is their proclamation. And there are many examples of miracles recorded in the Old Testament, and there are many witnesses being present to attest to that miraculous power, and they are encouraged to believe and behave in a specific and compliant way, so that they are compliant with the God of all creation. Now, of course, when we mention miracles to anybody, they're going to inevitably think of the miracles performed by Jesus. And a small delegation came to John the Baptist to inquire if he was the coming one. So turn with me, if you would, to Luke's Gospel record and chapter 7. Luke chapter 7, and it's verse 16, tells us that there was a great expectation. There came fear on all. They glorified God, saying that a great prophet is risen up among us, and that God hath visited his people. They were in great expectation. And verses 19 through to 23. John, calling unto him 2 of his disciples, sent them to Jesus, saying, Art thou he that should come, or look we for another? And when the men were come unto him, they said, John Baptist hath sent us unto thee, saying, Art thou he that should come, or look we for another? And in that same hour he cured many of their infirmities and plagues of evil spirits, and unto many that were blind he gave sight. Then Jesus answering said unto them, Go your way, and tell John what things ye have seen and heard, how that the blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, to the poor the gospel is preached, and blessed is he whosoever shall not be offended in me. So the demonstration here is of the things which Jesus was doing. And the disciples of John the Baptist saw it and reported that they had seen the blind given sight, the lame were made to walk, and so on. And so the gospel records tell us, of course, of the miraculous cases where there is healing and great wonders are performed. And all of these things are done so that they might believe. There was the case of the man let down through the roof by his friends so that he might be healed. Jesus doesn't at first heal the man, but says, Thy sins be forgiven thee. And that confuses, that causes great consternation. How can a man forgive sins? But in order to demonstrate that he had power, he then performs the miracle so that the man who's been let down, who is unable to walk, he is given the commandment to rise up and walk, and so he does. The evidence is then provided to give testimony to the teaching of the Lord Jesus. And of course, the reaction amongst people showed how these miracles, when they were performed, polarized opinions. To one group, he was the coming one. But to the leaders of the people and to many others, he was a threat. His miracles in the main, therefore, were discounted. They saw the same thing, but they drew entirely different conclusions from what they had seen. And such seems to be the way of man. We saw the same thing. One said he has a devil, the other he is the Son of God. It polarized opinions. In the same way that history is written by the victorious, it could be said that these accounts in the Gospels are written by sympathetic, at least, not to say credulous writers, a body of believers who were easily persuaded and wanted to promote a belief in something from which they might gain advantage. Witnesses to any event can be suspect, can't they? We saw the same thing, but our account of what we saw can be quite different. Historical witnesses are notoriously difficult to verify, aren't they? So that accusation is, of course, always going to be present when we're looking at the Bible. But bear with me if you would. In the Acts of the Apostles, and it's the section that Brother Lawrence read for us, Acts chapter 4, the disciples of Jesus are able to perform a miracle. And it brings a particularly useful comment with it when we read on. So the lame man, as we've read, is lame from his birth. He's healed by the power in Peter and John. And they are brought then before the rulers of the people. Chapter 4 and verse 13, when they saw the boldness of Peter and John, perceived that they were unlearned and ignorant men, they marveled, and they took knowledge of them, that they had been with Jesus. And beholding the man which was healed, standing with them, they could say nothing against it. It's really a really helpful comment, isn't it? And then it goes on. Verse 16. What shall we do to these men? For that indeed a notable miracle hath been done by them, is manifest to all them that dwell in Jerusalem, and we cannot deny it. I think it's a really powerful statement. We have here hostile witnesses who are forced to acknowledge that a miracle has been performed. But we weren't there. We have to rely on the testimony of others. Do we believe it? We know that even those that were present at various miracles didn't agree on what they'd seen, or at least if they agreed on what they saw, they drew conflicting conclusions from that event. Well, let's try a slightly different tack. Perhaps one of the greatest miracles which witnesses to the power of God is the resurrection of Jesus. And we can't consider that in detail. That'll take too long. But the resurrection of Jesus was an event which was foretold by Jesus himself, although he wasn't believed by those that were his closest companions. After the event, the Jewish and the Roman authorities had multiple opportunities to counter the claims made by the disciples, but they couldn't do it. Professional soldiers witnessed his death and burial. And then subsequently, a group of working class country folk testified to the events and were believed by multitudes. And the more you think about that, the more extraordinary it becomes. They did this, they believed, without any personal gain. Many lost their lives as a result of the testimony that they were giving. They were preaching something for which they were being ridiculed and taunted. Does that sound like a people who are credulous and gullible? I don't think it does. They weren't following orders. They didn't have a hierarchy that threatened them with consequences that were unpleasant. Far from it. The authorities, those in power, those in control, wanted it to be stopped, but they couldn't do it. The testimony concerning the resurrection of Jesus was accepted as fact. And the effect of the preaching of the disciples and the apostles turned the world upside down. It was against the run of things. It was beyond rational or scientific explanation. It was a miracle and evidence of the power of God, so that we might believe. Life itself is a miracle. Scientists, biologists demonstrate the processes beautifully, but they can't replicate or create life in its truest sense. They can't prevent death either. These things are outside of the scope of mankind to resolve. They're evidences of the power of God who reveals himself in the pages of our Bibles. I've one more miracle to share with you, which we should consider, that is a witness to the existence and the power of God. And that is the nation of Israel. A body of people calling themselves a nation are destroyed and scattered by the Romans AD 70 through to AD 132. Hundreds of thousands are slaughtered. Those that remain are scattered to the four corners of the world. And Jews are banished from what is then called or became to be called the land of Palestine. They're sold into the slave markets of the world. It's a fact that was foretold by the Jewish prophets centuries beforehand, but by the by. In all countries of the world, the Jews maintained their identity and were persecuted for that very identity. In large part, they maintained an allegiance to their faith through 2,000 years of wandering through the nations of the world, but entirely against the run of the things, entirely against the natural order. The late 19th century, Jews coalesced into a body politic once again under the banner of Zionism. And with the aid of Britain and the Western powers, they were able to re-establish the Jewish state in their ancient homeland. Is there another story like it? Is there another nation who've been dispersed in such a way, been brought back together to the land from which they'd been ejected centuries before? I don't think so. Each of the components of the Jewish story has their natural element, of course. An immigrant community is despised by their host nations in Europe, which lead to pogroms and persecution. And that drives one particular aspect. A megalomaniac rallies his people for a nationalistic purpose. That has its part to play also. And of course, there is the association of high-profile Jews with the government of this country, which led to favours being offered which might not otherwise have come about. And all of these things on the surface are natural enough, but with the benefit of the words revealed through the scriptures, an eye to see how things below the surface can help us appreciate and have a real trust that miracles do occur. Things against the ordinary run of nature, all working out to a plan which the God of the Bible has revealed. Things happen according to a scientific principle, fair enough. We've seen that since the 17th century. And to one who knows something of the science or laws of nature, perhaps the wonder of something becomes a little less wonderful. But let's not let our minds become blunted by the wisdom of science without God. The evidence for miracle and the power of God are there for us to see. The wider purpose which God has, as revealed through the Bible, will most certainly come to pass according to his plan. Thank you.